On the morning of February 26, 2025, maintenance workers arrived at a gated property in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They walked through the front door and found two bodies in separate rooms. There were no signs of a struggle, and there was no obvious explanation. The man in the mudroom entryway was 95 years old. He was lying next to a pair of sunglasses and a walking cane. It was Gene Hackman. 2 Academy Awards, dozens of films, one of the great American screen actors of the 20th century. He had been dead for 8 days before anyone came. So how does that happen to a man like this? The story starts a long way from Santa Fe, in Danville, Illinois, in the summer of 1943. Gene Hackman was 13 years old, playing in the street with his friends, when his father's car came around the corner. His father slowed down, looked at him through the window, raised one hand, and drove away. That was the last time Gene Hackman ever saw his father. There was no argument before it, no scene, no explanation left behind, just a wave from a moving car, and then the man was gone. Hackman talked about that moment decades later in a Vanity Fair interview with the precision of someone who had turned it over in his mind 1,000 times. It was a real adios, he said. Maybe that's why I became an actor. I doubt I would have become so sensitive to human behavior if that hadn't happened to me, if I hadn't realized how much one small gesture can mean. He was left with his mother in a house in Illinois with no money, no plan, and no answer to the question of why his father had left. The boy who learned to read a gesture from 40 feet away would spend the next 40 years teaching audiences to feel things they hadn't expected to feel. But before any of that, he had to find his own way out of Danville. 3 years after his father drove off, Hackman walked into a Marine Corps recruitment office and lied about his age. He was 16 years old. The military didn't know that. He enlisted, shipped out to basic training at Parris Island, South Carolina, and within months, he was on a transport vessel crossing the Pacific. He rode out severe weather somewhere along the way, possibly a typhoon, the accounts differ, and arrived at his posting in China as a radio operator. He eventually became a disc jockey for Armed Forces Radio in the Pacific, a detail that, looking back, says something about the performer already forming underneath the uniform. He finished his high school education while serving. He was honorably discharged in 1951, 21 years old, and came home to the United States with no real plan beyond a vague sense that the world was bigger than Danville had suggested. He tried journalism, studied television production on the GI Bill, and worked a string of jobs that led nowhere in particular. By most ordinary measures, he was a man without direction. Then someone suggested acting, and something shifted. He enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse in California, one of the most respected acting schools in the country, where he met a 19-year-old student named Dustin Hoffman. The two of them became friends right away. They played congas together on the roof of the building, trying to channel Marlon Brando. 2 young men with more ambition than technique. Their classmates voted on who among them was most likely to succeed in the industry. Hackman and Hoffman finished last. Then, after 3 months, the Playhouse expelled Hackman. The stated reason? He didn't have any talent. It was the first time in the school's history they had done that to anyone. When Hackman died, Hoffman delivered a tribute and chose his words carefully. He was expelled from our school after 3 months for not having talent, Hoffman said. It was the first time they ever did that. He was that good. Hackman and Hoffman packed up and moved to New York, where they shared an apartment with another young actor named Robert Duvall. The 3 of them spent years auditioning, failing, and working whatever jobs they could find. Hackman sold shoes and moved furniture, and he worked the door at a building in Manhattan. One evening, a former Marine officer walked through the entrance, looked him over, and said, "Hackman, you're a sorry son." He kept the door job, he kept auditioning. The bottom, he later told an interviewer, was a very ugly place. He had been there before, and he knew how to stay standing. The break, when it finally came from an unlikely direction. In 1967, Warren Beatty was assembling the cast for Bonnie and Clyde, a film that would rewrite the rules of American cinema, and he cast Hackman as Buck Barrow, the volatile, fiercely loyal older brother of the film's outlaw hero. Hackman was 37 years old. He had been trying for 15 years. He had been expelled, humiliated, and told in various ways by various people that this was never going to work for him. None of that was visible on the screen. What was visible was something the industry had been slow to recognize, because it didn't look like what they expected from a movie star. Hackman didn't try to dazzle or charm. He simply inhabited the role, the way a man who had grown up reading human behavior in doorways and on street corners inhabits a character, from the inside out. Bonnie and Clyde earned him his first Oscar nomination. More importantly, it put him in rooms he had never been in before, with directors who understood what they were looking at. He wasn't the lead, but he was often more interesting than the lead. The industry filed that away. In 1971, director William Friedkin cast Hackman as Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, a New York narcotics cop chasing a heroin smuggling network with methods that sat somewhere between relentless and reckless. The role wasn't glamorous. Doyle was abrasive, morally compromised, running on instinct and adrenaline in a city that felt like it was coming apart at the seams. It was exactly the kind of role that needed what Hackman had been quietly developing for 2 decades: the ability to make an audience believe completely that what they were watching was a real human being making real decisions in real danger. The car chase sequence, shot through the elevated subway tracks and side streets of Brooklyn, remains one of the most viscerally convincing action sequences in American cinema. Hackman drove it like a man genuinely capable of that level of focused, frightening intensity. The film grossed $51 million. In April of 1972, Hackman stood on the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles and accepted the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 42 years old. The man who had been voted least likely to succeed, who had been expelled for not having talent, who had spent his 20s moving furniture and holding doors open for people who didn't know his name. That man was standing on the most recognized stage in the entertainment industry, holding the award that defines a career. Nobody in the room could quite believe it had taken this long. In 1984, at a gym in California, Hackman met a 31-year-old classical pianist named Betsy Arakawa. He was 54 years old. The age gap drew attention when it became public, and the press constructed the story they preferred, that Hackman had left his first wife for a younger woman. He pushed back on that directly. His first marriage had drifted apart over years, he said. It hadn't ended in some dramatic rupture. "I did not leave my real-life wife for a younger woman," he told one interviewer. The truth was quieter than the tabloid version. 2 people met, took 7 years to be certain, and married in 1991. They designed a home together in Santa Fe, a gated property on the high desert filled with art and music, the kind of deliberate quiet that 2 people build when they have decided to live away from the noise. Friends describe them as joined at the hip. Betsy edited his novels and received credit for it. He mentioned her in interviews with a warmth that was not performed. As his health declined over the years, the pacemaker, the heart condition, and eventually the early signs of what would be confirmed as Alzheimer's disease, Betsy became the person who held everything together. She managed the house, the medications, the appointments, the daily logistics of a life he could no longer fully navigate on his own. A year after the wedding, Hackman almost said no to the role that would put him on the Oscar stage a second time. Clint Eastwood had been preparing a Western called Unforgiven, and he wanted only one actor for the part of Sheriff Little Bill Daggett. He sent the script to Hackman. Hackman read it and turned him down. He was tired of violent films, he told Eastwood. He had done too many of them, and his daughters had been after him about it for years. Eastwood didn't take no for an answer. "Read it one more time," he asked. "I think we can make a great statement against violence and killing if we do this right." Hackman read the script again, came back, and said yes. The film opened in August of 1992 and became one of the most acclaimed westerns ever made. Hackman's performance as Little Bill, a small-town sheriff who runs his streets with his fists and a smile, was the dark heart of it. In March of 1993, 21 years after his first win, he stood on the Oscar stage a second time and accepted the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. No other pairing of films has bracketed a career quite like that one: The French Connection and Unforgiven. 2 decades apart, the same man. In July of 2004, Hackman appeared on Larry King Live and said quietly that he had no projects in development. He believed his acting career was essentially finished. There was no ceremony to it. He simply stopped. By 2008, a Reuters profile found him at home in Santa Fe, and he confirmed it without hesitation. Film was in his rear-view mirror. He had become a novelist by then, co-writing thrillers with a former Navy diver and researcher named Daniel Lenihan. He had no interest in talking about Hollywood. What came out over time was that the decision wasn't only a creative one. He had a heart condition and a pacemaker, on top of the cumulative wear of decades of work on a body that had also survived a Marine Corps motorcycle accident that broke both his legs and a car accident in Santa Fe in 2012. In his own words, he had simply run out of things he wanted to do. The industry assumed he had walked away at the top, The truth was closer to a man who had listened to his body and made a quiet, private decision on his own terms. He rode an e-bike through the streets of Santa Fe, painted in his studio, and occasionally appeared at a local diner. And the photographs would briefly go viral, because the appetite for glimpses of him never really faded. He didn't seem to notice. For a man whose face had been on movie screens for 30 years, the privacy seemed to be the whole point. On February 9, 2025, Betsy Arakawa picked up one of their dogs from a veterinary appointment in Santa Fe. 2 days later, on the 11th, surveillance cameras at the gate of their community recorded her car leaving the property. She ran her errands, a stop at a CVS pharmacy, a visit to the Sprouts Farmers Market, and returned home around 5:15 in the afternoon. That was the last time anyone outside those walls saw her alive. Her emails went unanswered after that day. Her phone went quiet. In the days leading up to it, her Google search history told a quiet story of someone trying to solve something on her own. She was searching for flu-like symptoms, for breathing difficulties, for techniques for managing respiratory distress. A woman alone in a house with a sick husband, feeling something wrong in her own body, looking online for the answers she never found in time. On the morning of February 12th, she called the Santa Fe Medical Clinic and asked about treatment. They scheduled her for 1:15 that afternoon. She didn't make the appointment. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is a rare and devastating respiratory illness, transmitted through contact with infected rodent droppings, deer mice in this case, common to the high desert of New Mexico. The disease moves fast, filling the lungs with fluid and leaving almost no time between the first symptoms and the point of no return. Investigators believe Betsy Arakawa, 65 years old, died on or around February 12th. She was found in the bathroom next to a space heater. An open prescription bottle on the counter beside her suggested she had been trying to treat what she felt until she could no longer do anything at all. Hackman's pacemaker recorded its final activity on February 18th, 7 days after his wife. His Alzheimer's, by then in its advanced stages, had likely left him without the ability to understand that she had not moved or spoken in days. The chief medical investigator stated it plainly at the press conference. It is quite possible, she said, that he was not aware she was deceased. He was found in the mudroom entryway, next to his sunglasses and his walking cane, as though he had been heading somewhere and simply stopped. He had not eaten in a long time. On February 26th, maintenance workers arrived. The world found out 8 days after he had died. The tributes came in within hours. Dustin Hoffman called him a giant among actors. Clint Eastwood, Morgan Freeman, Francis Ford Coppola, they all spoke of him in the same kind of language. The industry that had once expelled him for having no talent said goodbye in the way industries do. Informal statements, award show montages, and carefully worded appreciations of a career that had spanned 5 decades and produced some of the most enduring performances in American cinema. What those tributes didn't quite capture was the shape of the life that ran underneath the career. A boy in Danville who stood in the street and watched his father wave from a car window and understood at 13 years old that the smallest gesture can carry the weight of everything. A young man who lied his way into the Marines, got expelled from acting school, and worked the door of a Manhattan building while a former officer told him he was a sorry son of a... He kept going anyway. Optimism didn't have much to do with it. He was the kind of man who had already survived the worst thing, and he knew the rest was manageable. He left behind 2 Academy Awards, a retirement on his own terms, and a marriage that lasted 34 years in a home in the high desert that they had built together. He also left behind a final chapter that no one scripted and no one saw. A man in the advanced stages of a disease that had taken most of what he knew, alone in a quiet house in New Mexico in the days after the woman who had held his world together was already gone. He had spent his entire life reading gestures, translating small human moments into something an audience could feel. In the end, the last one was his own. A pair of sunglasses and a walking cane on the floor of a mudroom, and 8 days of silence before anyone came. If this story moved you, you're in the right place. Offscript publishes new documentaries every week, the real stories behind the names you grew up watching. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below. We'd love to know what part of Gene Hackman's story you never knew. We'll see you in the next one.